Hi everybody, and welcome to this online module for language enrichment strategies. This particular module was part of a larger body of work that was delivered as a series of workshops in late 2011 and early 2012, and it was designed primarily for tutors and managers working in workplace literacy. In this particular module, we decided to put it online to act as a refresher to people who had already done the workshops, and also to provide some content for people who hadn't been to the workshop so they could see what the topics of discussion were. This module will probably take about 12 minutes to complete, and these are the three things we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss language issues in the workplace, and primarily it's going to be around ESOL learners. So that is learners who've come in to New Zealand and English is their second language. So they might be from Cambodia, they might be from the Philippines, they may have learnt some English in their country and now they're working in a full immersion English workforce. And we're going to discuss some of the issues that you might notice when you go into a workplace. We're also going to look at a model for language for the workplace, and this is probably a new model for the sector, dovetails very nicely with the learning progressions. So we'll put that up for discussion as well. And we're going to explore a structured conversational model. And I'm just going to talk through each of the PowerPoints as they come up. Jane Wagner said, "I personally believe we developed language because of our deep inner need to complain." And you know, if you look at the debates around why we speak and how language developed, what Jane is getting at here is that, you know, our need to express ourselves, and in her words, complain, has driven us to develop language. But what it does highlight is that we need as human beings to be able to express ourselves clearly. And one of the key issues, of course, is if you're working in a workplace where your first language is not the primary mode of communication, this becomes very difficult. And this can cause challenges, or create challenges for first language speakers of English and second language. And so we're going to discuss some of those. In the workshops, we ask people to, you know, discuss this question. In what ways can first language differences impact the workplace? And a lot of the people in the workshops, of course, had been working in workplaces where there was a fairly significant group of the workforce who did have English as a second language, and there were some key issues that came up. If we look at the research and also using anecdotes from New Zealand and my personal experience, these are some of the things that pop up. There's two of them. There's the immediate impacts, and there's also long-term impacts. And here's some of the things that might be happening on more of a micro scale. If you have an English supervisor, or a New Zealand supervisor, sorry, who's speaking English, and he's handing down instructions to a group of people who might have English as a second language, here are some of the things that might arise. You might find that instructions are not fully understood. You might also find that the importance of key tasks is not understood. So in terms of knowing where the task fits in the big picture, sometimes that is not well conveyed and not fully appreciated by the employees. Task feedback cycles occasionally are not completed, and this is where the people completing a task would normally come back to the supervisor, and if there are any key issues that had arisen while doing that task, they'd feed that back. In some cases, this feedback cycle is not operating how it should be. Mitigation across hierarchies refers to how some individuals interact with their supervisors or superiors, and this is interesting. This is where language and culture cannot be separated. In some cultures, it would be considered bad manners to correct your supervisor, and in some cultures it's perfectly appropriate to tell your supervisor or give your supervisor additional information that would help them do their job. So there's a clash of cultures. In some cultures, you wouldn't correct your supervisor, or you wouldn't fill them in on certain information. You just try and do what they said to the best of your ability. And of course you can see in a New Zealand context how that could have long-term flow-on effects. Another immediate impact is paralinguistic cues are often missed. If you were to go to another country where they spoke a different language than English, you would notice things, for example, that perhaps you didn't quite get the humour, even if you understood much of the language. Humour, sarcasm, because of the tone of voice and inflection and so on. So these are some of the issues that speakers of English as a second language face when they come to New Zealand and work in the workplace. The long-term impacts are the things you're likely to hear from managers if you're called into a workplace where they have particular challenges or issues around speakers of English as a second language. You might find that there are inefficiencies happening. Things could be happening better, and communication of course could be happening better. Mistakes might be beginning to be made regularly. There may be poor team unity or rapport breakdown between people who speak English fluently and those who don't, and this of course comes back to those cultural things as well. And often the communication being different leads to a lack of trust in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, and this generally slows down a growth in productive capacity. And productive capacity refers to a company's ability to improve their ability to produce. So as a workforce becomes more and more skilled, they should learn from their mistakes and improve them and so on, and be better at what they're doing. So the company's ability to produce more in a given time frame would increase. And often what happens with the rapport breakdown and the mistakes and so on is that this in fact slows right down, and in some cases it stops or goes backwards. And language issues are a component of this in many cases, certainly not the entire component. Your role as a literacy provider in the workplace will be to identify these and then try to correct what's been going on. So we're going to shift here and move to how language develops. Language develops out of responding and receiving language in real social situations. It's not learnt in discrete bites. And Owen says it does little good to discuss language outside the framework provided by communication. And as we mentioned earlier, language and culture go hand in hand, and it's very difficult to separate these two. So we're going to look at a model that really looks at how language works in the workplace. Now I'm not sure if you're familiar with this model before, whether you've seen it before, but it's been around for a while. It's called the Functionalist model, and it's a model of language that's pretty well established within linguistics. What we've got is we've got four key components of language in the middle: phonology, syntax, morphology and semantics. And then they're all embedded firmly within pragmatics. And we'll just go through each bit by bit. Phonology refers to the sound of a language, your ability to pronounce the sounds in a language. So if you're beginning to learn a new language, initially you'll be concerned with pronouncing those words. And each language generally has its own unique sounds. And if you're an adult, trying to master those sounds might prove a bit of a challenge, and mastering how to hear them might also prove to be a challenge. So phonology is around pronunciation, saying those words and hearing those sounds. Syntax has to do with grammar, that is the words that are the order that words are in. For example, the dog chased the lion chased the dog. Two completely separate sentences with completely different meanings, and yet the words are exactly the same, and it's the syntax that changes the meaning of those sentences. Morphology has to do with particular words, the meanings of key words. So this tends to align somewhat in the learning progressions with the vocabulary progressions. So morphology is about the way words work. For example, dig and digging have slightly different meanings, and that's the morphology of the word. Then we have semantics, which is meaning. Semantics is around understanding what the meaning of a sentence is. And so you can see they all kind of feed into each other. You'd need to be able to pronounce a word, put words in order, and then look at individual words and then the meaning of words as well. They all sit within a larger body, which is pragmatics. And pragmatics is concerned with getting things done through language, actually using language to make things happen. And in the workplace, it's all about pragmatics, using the language you've got to achieve something. And where this differs somewhat from semantics, if we give you the sentence, you walk into a room and you say, "It's hot in here," or "This room is hot." You would say, "This room is hot," and if we just looked at it from a semantic point of view, it means this room is hot, the temperature in this room is high. But if we look at it in a broader picture of pragmatics, "This room is hot" might actually have some meaning behind it outside of the sentence. It might actually mean, hey, let's open some windows, or let's turn the heater off, or let's do something to cool this room down. So within the context, that sentence might have different meanings. And so pragmatics is concerned with the context, how language works in the workplace. Phonology would probably align somewhat in terms of the learning progressions for the encoding and decoding progressions, and of course the speaking and listening progressions as well. Syntax most likely aligns with language and text features. Morphology again would be around vocabulary, and we know we have vocabulary in terms of speaking and listening and reading and writing. Semantics would have something to do there with the comprehension progressions, understanding what you're listening to and reading, and pragmatics again is the wider body that they all sit within. A key thing to keep in mind here is that these components of language will develop during structured conversations, not before structured conversations. And structured conversations is something that we're going to be looking at soon. But as you look at this model, why I thought it would be useful to bring it up is because it's good to know what aspect you're trying to develop in learners. So if you've got a learner who's at the lower end of the English spectrum, phonology and syntax are probably likely to be some of the key things you look at. I know I've worked with learners who primarily it's a pronunciation of the language that's causing them difficulty. Syntax as well might be an issue, and morphology is usually something that takes a little longer to develop, and semantics of course. So key tasks that you use with your ESOL learners in the workplace will probably be developing a combination of these together, but might have a ability to strengthen one more than the other. So we're going to look at a particular strategy, and this strategy, keep in mind, is for learners at the lower end of the English spectrum. So this is for learners who are still mastering English, and in fact might be still at the phonological stage, or developing their syntax and so on. So we're going to talk about an activity called a structured conversation, and it has pros and cons to it. So we'll go through it and then we'll look at what the pros and cons are. Structured conversations provide the introduction of vocabulary, syntax, semantics, and phonology. I should just describe it. Structured conversation is where you have a pre-planned conversation with a learner. Certainly you have a plan of what you're going to say. The learner will have to adapt. But you have already pre-planned some of the things you're going to say. So it's not just a free-flowing conversation, but it could certainly turn into that very quickly. You're going to be learning about the use of conventions of verbal interactions, or the learner you're working with, well, a safe environment based on modeling and practice. So a structured conversation is a safe environment, and it also allows for content involvement by using a workplace topic. So just to provide some context for this, it might be that you are working with a particular learner in the workplace who has English as a second language, and you decide to use a structured conversation approach with them perhaps just for a part of the sessions you're setting with them. These would be some of the things that you would be using with them. Structured conversations can be used across 3 levels. Level 1 is simple modeling, and this is where you would say something and the learner simply copies you. So it's as simple as that. They are developing in this skill the skill of phonology here and syntax. So they're trying to just copy you and get a feel for the language. Level 2, they are responding. You would say something and they would reply to you freely. And level 3, initiating. This is where the learner initiates the conversation and you reply. And we'll go through each of these one by one. How to begin. So this is where to start in terms of setting up a structured conversation. A good thing to do is to identify a workplace artifact, and that is a well-known workplace object. So what you would want is something that is fairly common in the workplace, that lots of conversations take place around. And in the use of the example I'm going to show you, we used a design sheet for a particular company we worked in. Design sheets were the main mode of communication, and they were something that touched every part of the company, from the design team to the people putting together component parts. The design sheet really was the one thing that united all parts of the company. A second thing to do is to identify and rank key words. So you're going to create a contextualized word list that your learner is going to learn. You're going to explain to the learner that simply to copy the speech, but to focus on tone, pace, stress and inflection. So this is where you're going to say something and the learner is going to copy you, and you're getting them to focus on the tone of your voice, the pace and the stress and the inflection. And you're going to open with a simple sentence and gradually progress to more complex syntax and phonology. And this will all become clear as we move on to the example. Now when I use this, when I talk about design plans, the artifact that we chose for the workplace were the design plans, and the design plans look something like this. This is not a real design plan, but this is something that is like what we used. And you can imagine this on an A3 sheet of paper, and a normal design plan would give you all the component parts and measurements around a key component. So this was our artifact that we were going to have a structured conversation around. Now before we met with the learner, we would develop a word list based on this artifact. So the word list we used was design sheet, component, clamp-on, bracket, vertical plate, dimensions, tolerance, girder, pre-stressor and design. And the idea was that these are the words that are being used in conversation regularly around the workplace, and so these are the words we wanted to begin to develop for our learner. And this is how it would work. We'd sit down, we'd have the A3 sheet, the design sheet in front of us, and we'd begin a level 1 conversation around it. And the tutor would simply say something and the learner is to copy it. So the tutor would say, this is a method sheet. Method sheet was the term for the design sheet. The learner would say, this is a method sheet. So they're attempting to copy the tone of the sentence. This is a method sheet of a clamp-on. So the idea here, the third line down, is the tutor is developing vocabulary around this. This is a method sheet of a clamp-on. The learner repeats the word and begins to develop that vocabulary. The clamp-on is 1,000 millimeters in length, and so on. And the learner would continue to repeat it. Now the idea with this is that you keep the vocabulary and the sentences small, and the learner simply has an opportunity to copy words. So they're developing their phonology and syntax, and they're also developing a bit of vocabulary within this. If we go to level 1 advanced, we can see, still using the method sheet as an object, we could say to the tutor, this is a method sheet that describes a machine component. The learner would repeat that. This is a method sheet that describes a machine component, and they're attempting to copy the exact tone and the language as well. This is a method sheet that describes a grab arm. This is a method sheet that describes its size. So you can see the learner is beginning to adapt and trying to add their own vocabulary in, and the idea is that's okay. The tutor then seeks to extend the learner, so says, yes, this is a method sheet that describes the dimensions of a grab arm. And the learner repeats, this is the method sheet that describes the dimensions of a grab arm. So as you can see, it's designed for learners at the lower end of the learning continuum, or the English continuum. You've got key components of language there, so for example, this is the component is the word, and you're attempting to introduce that vocabulary as you go. If level 1 is too easy or becomes boring, as it would, the idea is that you'd only be doing it for 5 minutes at a time, maybe not even that. Then you would move to level 2, which is responsive. And for level 2, a structured conversation at level 2, the tutor pre-prepares the questions, so it's much the same as the previous one. The tutor gradually introduces complex pre-planned vocabulary. So again, you have your vocabulary list and you have those planned to be used. And the tutor gradually increases the question complexity, and the tutor asks probing questions using key vocabulary. So here's an example. The tutor would say, "What is this?" pointing to the design sheet. The learner responds, "This is a design sheet. It shows the size of a component of machinery." The tutor says, "What is this piece of machinery and what are its dimensions?" The learner says, "This is a grab arm. This method sheet shows that it is 1,000 millimeters in length and 200 millimeters across." Tutor, "So it is 1,000 millimeters long and 200 millimeters across. What is the depth measurement?" 100 millimeters in depth. So even though this looks like a natural conversation, certainly more than level 1, the tutor has got the key vocabulary that they're trying to introduce, and they're also gradually extending the complexity of the sentence as well. So it's still fairly tight in terms of what it does, and the idea is if you've built the foundation with level 1, you've built in the vocabulary, pronunciation and so on, that this should flow quite naturally out of that. If we go to level 3 is where the learner will initiate. So the learner should be told to prepare for the activity. The learner initiates the conversation, and the learner uses increasing complex vocabulary. So you would provide the word list to the learner, and they would seek to use this in the conversation. And so it might go something like this. The learner would say, "This is a method sheet. A method sheet is a design for a component of machinery." Tutor says, "Tell me what this particular component is." The learner says, "This component is the clamp-on. The method sheet gives us dimensions. It also tells us how to assemble several components to the clamp-on. Do you know what the symbol and measurement mean?" And so you can see here the learner is actually asking questions. The tutor says, "Not really, tell me." They show the tolerance that the bore must be within. How do you find the tolerance? And so you can see this is a far more sophisticated conversation where the learner has gone and is learning to use these words in a safe environment. And so the idea is that you might spend a week perhaps at level 1, a week or 2 at level 2, and then the rest of the time at level 3 at the initiation stage. And the learner is gaining competence with the vocabulary list that you've given them. And now they're talking fluently with the words you've given them, for example, component, tolerance, measurement, assemble. And so at the end of your time working with an ESOL learner, they've really become comfortable with you and are able to experiment with their language and develop. That's the idea of a structured conversation. Now, one of the criticisms of structured conversations is that they're too limiting. So they limit the learner and they're so structured that the learner has to stay within these bounds. That's not the idea at all. As soon as the learner is capable of branching out on their own, then you drop that level and you move them up to the next level straight away. So you should never be tying them into a model. So level 1, where you're saying it and the learner is repeating it, that is an entirely appropriate activity for a learner who is seeking to improve their pronunciation, master key vocabulary, and just have a nice safe environment where they can practice saying things. And of course, as soon as that is no longer appropriate, drop it, move to level 2, drop it, move to level 3. So you move as quickly as you can. The idea is you identify that key vocabulary and also an artifact that you have conversations around, a key artifact, and that's important. So just as a final wrap up, language issues in the workplace, we can see that when somebody's learning English as a second language and having to use it in the workplace, it can cause issues around language and also social and cultural issues as well. And your role as a workplace literacy provider is to identify these and address them. We've looked at a model of language acquisition. It is actually a model of language acquisition and also a model of language for the workplace. And that included phonology, which is around how people pronounce those words, syntax, which is grammar, morphology, which is how words work, individual words, semantics, meaning, and they all sit within the larger body of pragmatics, getting things done in the workplace. How does that language work in the workplace? And we've explored a structured conversation model, and I would recommend, if you want more on this, that you look it up on the internet, or that you go through this again and just look at those key conversations from each level and experiment, try it out and see how it works. The structured conversation model is built on the idea that you find an appropriate workplace artifact, and your vocabulary comes out of that artifact, and that artifact is culturally appropriate for the learner. Good luck with your tuition. Wish you all the best. Bye bye.